데이비드 강은 강의 2편에서 한국이 지금 얼마나 큰 발전을 한 나라인지에 대해 이야기했습니다. 전쟁을 겪고 아무것도 없었던 나라였지만 수십 년 만에 다양한 분야에서 세계를 선도하며 성장한 나라가 한국이라고 설명했는데요. 전 근대사로 이어지는 3편의 이야기에서는 한국과 유럽을 비교하는 강의가 계속되었습니다. 많은 사람들이 한국은 항상 외세의 침략을 당해왔다고 생각하지만 오히려 유럽과 비교하면 동아시아의 국가들은 나름대로의 질서를 유지하며 비교적 안정적인 국제관계를 지켜왔다고 설명하였습니다. 강의 함께 보시죠.
So I'm gonna talk now about pre-modern Korean history a little bit. And I'm going to leave you with, I want to start with a question, which I don't expect you to be able to answer. But how many times did Japan and China invade Korea? Does anybody know? I mean, I just heard Mary mentioning it before, so I think it gave away a little bit. But I don't expect you to. I didn't know before I started doing this research. You don't have to give me a number, but does anybody think they could come up with an answer? You guys are too well trained. This will not be on the test. Yeah, I mean, the popular perception is that Korea has just been constantly invaded. We're the small country, the big countries do whatever they want. And I'm going to give you a different story, actually, and one that shows a lot more stability in East Asia, which for those of you who do world history or whatever else, is actually, I think, one of the most interesting things about East Asian history, is how it actually worked, right? Because if we go to Europe, and we all know this, right? The history of Europe is a blood-soaked series of unending wars against each other. From the 100 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the, just on and on and on, right? Napoleon, Trafalgar, etc. In Europe, you had a bunch of similarly sized states, kingdoms, whatever, that spent centuries beating the stuffing out of each other. And the best way to show this is if you put a map. So this is Europe in 1300, and we have a whole bunch of political units here that don't exist anymore, right? So there's Crown of Castile or Genoa and Savoy, Duchy of Guienne, whatever, right? A whole bunch of political units. And in fact, the Europe that we know today really didn't even begin to come into focus until the 19th century. So Europe by 1800 is beginning to look like Spain and Portugal, but you still have Sardinia, you still have Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, Torino, Helvetic Republic, the Ottoman Empire. So borders in Europe changed constantly as kingdoms rose and fell and people conquered each other and moved back and forth. The Europe that we know today is actually really recent. Now, in contrast, in East Asia, the four main states of East Asia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China, have basically existed for well over 1,000 years. Their borders changed a little bit, but these are identifiably the same units. And so Korea became Korea around the 7th century. Now, there's a lot of historical debate over this kingdom called Goguryeo. But essentially, there were three kingdoms on the Korean peninsula. Before then, the Baekje, Shilla, and Goguryeo. This Kaya was a smaller thing. Before then, around 200 AD, there were a bunch of little tribes, things back and forth. These kingdoms developed around 200, so that by 600 AD, you had basically three large kingdoms. Yamato Japan, the Japanese state that we know today, roughly traces its emergence to around the 6th or 7th century. Before then, again, just a bunch of little tribes or something. But there we can trace a political heritage. Now, the interesting thing is that here there was a world war. There was a world war, meaning everybody who could be involved was involved. Right? So the Japanese allied with Baekje, Shilla allied with Tang China. Shilla and Tang crushed Goguryeo. They then beat up Baekje, and the Japanese sent some troops. They sent them home. So there was a massive war, a couple decades, and when the dust settled, you basically had the beginnings of a unified Korean political unit, which covered 2/3 of the peninsula, around 700 AD. And that political unit basically sort of pushed northwards so that by the 10th century, the border with China was this thing called the Yalu River. So you still have unified Shilla, and it sort of pushed northwards. By the Chosun dynasty of 1400, they had basically filled out to what it looks like today, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Because this region up here, as you may or may not know, the Manchurian region is basically wilderness. It's really cold, it's desolate, it's big mountains, nobody really lives there. So the border that did get demarcated by 1000 AD was the Yalu River. This was the most important border because this is where people from Korea went over to China to trade, and they went back and forth. Up here is just a bunch of wilderness. And over the centuries, the frontier began to turn more and more into a border. So now there's the Yalu and the Tumen rivers. And this right here is, again, wilderness mountains. And that was settled and demarcated between China and Korea in the 18th century, 1711. Now, why is this interesting? Literally 1,000 years, this river has been the border between China and Korea. That's an astonishing amount of stability between two recognizably political units that exist today. The same thing actually in Vietnam. Vietnam and China, Proto-Vietnam at the time, demarcated a border with China at Lan Song. In 1999, when they did the formal modern treaty with the border, it's this exact same place that it had been since basically the 10th century. That's an astonishing amount of stability between political units. They expanded in other directions into frontiers, but between these political units, an enormous amount of stability.